The small wooden horse was the size of a hen's egg. It had been carved by a hand that knew the work. The mane had been notched in with the corner of a thin blade. The four legs had been shaped from a single piece of pine, set in pose, so the horse stood lifted at the right foreleg, as if the horse had been about to walk forward and had been caught. The paint on the horse had once been brown. The paint had worn through, at the rump and the muzzle, to the bare pine underneath. One ear had been chipped. The chip was old. The chip had been smoothed by some small hand that had been holding the horse, on and off, for at least 2 years. The horse was held now by the same small hand. The small hand was closed around the horse in the kind of tight, unconscious grip a child takes on a thing she has decided to take with her into death. The small hand was attached to the small wrist of a small girl whose age, by the careful estimate of the only adult in the room, who had ever guessed the ages of small girls for a living, was no more than 6 years and no less than 5. The small girl was not dead. The small girl was dying. The small girl was lying on the kitchen table of the widow Magdalena Ross, in the cabin at the western end of the small frontier town of Silver Pine, Oregon Territory, on the evening of the 8th of December, 1883. The kitchen lamp had been turned up to the 3rd notch. The kettle on the back of the iron stove had been pushed forward to the front plate. The clean linen had been brought down from the cupboard. The leather medicine satchel had been opened on the bench beside the table. The clay pots of dried yarrow leaf and willow bark and golden seal root had been set out, 3 in a row beside the linen. The hands at the table that were not the small child's hands were 2 pairs. The first pair belonged to Magdalena Ross, age 38. The plus-size widowed healer the women of Silver Pine had been calling, in their own kitchens, all manner of small, careful words for the last 3 years. The hands of Magdalena Ross had been cutting away the small wool coat from the small body of the child for the last 7 minutes. The coat had been cut from the throat to the hem. The coat had been peeled back. The small chest under the coat had been blue at the lips and white at the cheeks, and the small ribs had been moving in the kind of slow, shallow breath that says the body has decided to give up the work in the next half hour if no one helps it. The second pair of hands belonged to the man who had carried the child into the cabin at 20 minutes past 5 that evening, with the door kicked open by his own boot and his own arms full of the small body and his own face, the color of the new snow on his coat. The man's name was Hosea Kincaid. He was 44 years old. He had lived for 11 years in a small cabin on the high ridge 12 miles north of Silver Pine. He had not been to Silver Pine, by his own count, more than 9 times in those 11 years. He had not been to the front door of Magdalena Ross's cabin, by her count, ever. He had been there now. The small wooden horse was the first thing Magdalena Ross had noticed when she had lifted the small wrist to take the small pulse. She had not, in 22 years of catching babies and stitching cuts and pulling fevers down off frontier children, ever taken the pulse of a child whose other hand had been so closed around a thing. She did not, in the first 7 minutes, ask the man at the foot of the table what the horse was. She did not, in the first 7 minutes, ask the man at the foot of the table where the child had come from, or whose child the child was, or how the child had come to be in his arms on a snow, heavy December evening at the front door of a healer who, by every account in the small town of Silver Pine, was not supposed to be receiving any patient sent to her by any man. She had not, by the count of the doctor at the south end of the town named Dr. Alfred Pell, been a real healer for 3 years. She would not, on the morning that followed this evening, be told otherwise by Dr. Alfred Pell. But that morning was still 9 hours away. The evening was now. She put the kettle on. She unfolded the linen. She set the small wooden horse aside on the table, careful, where the small fist could reach back to it. She bent her head to the small chest. She said, low, without looking up, "Mr. Kincaid." He said, "Ma'am," she said. "Where did you find her?" He said, "South side of the high pass, 10 miles up." The wagon was overturned in a draw. The driver and the woman beside him were dead under the wagon. The child was 20 feet down the slope, under the runner of a small trunk that had been thrown out of the bed. She had been there, by my best count, since the morning. The wagon had gone over in the storm last night. Magdalena said, "How long until you reached her?" I had been tracking elk along the ridge. I saw the wagon by the small column of smoke from the cooking fire the dead man had built before the wagon went over. I reached her by 2 in the afternoon. I carried her down. I rode straight to your door. I did not stop at the doctor's, she said. Why not? He said, because the doctor at the south end of this town is the man who told my own neighbor's wife 2 winters ago that he would not ride out to her cabin in the snow. The wife was alive when he refused. The wife was dead by the morning. I have not forgotten. The child in your hand will not live 3 more hours if anyone refuses her. I did not refuse her. I did not bring her to anyone who would. Magdalena Ross did not look up. She said very low, "Mr. Kincaid." The small wooden horse on the table beside her. "You found it on her," he said. "It was in her hand when I lifted the trunk off her shoulder. She did not let go. She has not let go in the 4 hours since." She said, "Did you find anything else on her?" He said, "Yes, Mum, I did." She said, "What?" He said, "A small folded piece of paper, pinned to the inside of her coat. The paper is in my breast pocket. I have not opened it. I would like, with your permission, to open it together with you, when the child is on the other side of this evening." Magdalena Ross set her ear against the small chest. She listened. She lifted her head. She set her hands on the small ribs. She set her right palm under the small back. She said, "Mr. Kincaid." He said, "Mom," she said, "sit down at the foot of this table. Take her left hand in your right hand. Do not let her drop the horse. Whatever the next 2 hours bring, you hold the horse in her fist." He sat down. He took her left hand in his right. The small fingers were the cold of a wax doll. He folded the small fist around the small wooden horse. He held the small fist closed with his own large hand. Magdalena Ross went to work. The small wooden horse stayed in the small fist for the next 2 hours and 17 minutes. It would stay there for the next 11 days. It would, by the end of those 11 days, become the only thing in the cabin at the western end of Silver Pine, Oregon Territory, that any soul in the town would be willing to put a name to, because the name on the folded piece of paper in Hosea Kincaid's breast pocket was the name of a man the town of Silver Pine had reason, by the morning of the 12th day, to wish they had never heard. But that was 11 days away. The evening was now. The small wooden horse stood in the small closed fist on the kitchen table. The lamp on the table burned at the 3rd notch. The kettle began to boil. The small girl did not wake that night. She did not wake on the morning of the 9th either. She did not, in fact, open her eyes for the first time in any honest way until the evening of the 11th of December, 3 full nights and 2.5 days after the door of the cabin had been kicked open by Hosea Kincaid's boot. When her eyes did open, on the evening of the 11th, she opened them only for a quarter minute. She looked at the cabin ceiling. She looked at the kitchen lamp on the table, at the corner of her line of sight. She looked at the small wooden horse, which had been moved to her bedside table 6 hours before because Magdalena Ross had at last been able to coax the small fist open enough to wipe the small palm clean of the dirt, and the small splinters and the dried blood the horse had been pressing into the small skin. The small girl looked at the small wooden horse. She closed her eyes. She slept for another 16 hours. In those first 3 days, while the small body fought the fever, and the small lungs cleared by quarter inches the cold that had been driven into them in the draw below the high pass, Magdalena Ross and Hosea Kincaid sat at the small girl's bedside in shifts. Magdalena took the day, Hosea took the night. They did not speak much during the changes. They did not have many words to spare. Magdalena's words were going into the small girl's body in the form of yarrow tea and willow bark and the small, careful drops of warm broth she fed. through the small parted lips by the spoonful every 20 minutes. Hosea's words were not going anywhere, because Hosea Kincaid was a man who had not been a man for words in 11 years. But on the morning of the second day, when Magdalena came in from feeding the chickens to find Hosea at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and the small folded piece of paper open in his hand, she set the egg basket down on the bench by the door, and she came across the room, and she sat down across from him, and she said, "Mr. Kincaid." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Read it to me." He said, "Will you read it yourself first?" She said, "I would rather you read it. I would rather hear it in the voice of the man who found her than in my own voice, in my own head." He nodded. He held the small folded piece of paper up in the lamplight. The paper was the kind of soft brown paper that a small storekeeper sells for wrapping, a parcel. The paper had been folded into a square, the size of a small biscuit. The paper had been written on, by the look of the small, careful pencil hand, by someone who had been in a hurry, and who had not, by the way the last word fell off the line, finished the writing. Hosea read. He read in his slow, careful voice, the way a man reads aloud, who has been raised by a Tennessee Methodist mother, who would not let her sons mumble at the Bible verse. "To the person who finds this child," he read, "her name is Tessamy Hartley. Her age is 5 years and 8 months. Her birthday is the 2nd of April. Her mother is Eliza Hartley of Marion County, Indiana. Her father is Caleb Hartley of the same. We are riding west to my brother's homestead at Roseburg in the southwest of this territory. If you have found this paper, it is because we did not make it. Please, of God's mercy, do not send her back east. There is no one east who will take her. There is a small painted horse in her left coat pocket. The horse was carved for her by her father on her 3rd birthday. Please do not lose the horse. It is the only thing on this earth she has wanted to hold for 2 years. Her father will be the larger of the 2 dead. He is sandy-haired. He has a small scar on his left ear. I, her mother, have black hair. I am wearing a green wool dress and a small silver locket with the picture of my priest. Own mother. Inside the locket, on the back of the picture, is a list of the people we know in Roseburg. There are 3 names on the list. Any one of them is a person of conscience. I have written this on the 3rd day of the storm, in case the storm takes us before the food does. God keep the child." Hosea Kincaid stopped reading. He did not look up at Magdalena Ross. He set the paper down on the kitchen table between them. He set his hands flat on either side of the paper. He said, "Lo." "Ma'am," Magdalena said, "Mr. Kincaid." He said, "There were 3 names on a list, inside a silver locket on the chest of the dead mother under the wagon." She said, "I know." He said, "I read the names before I climbed down to the child." She said, "I know." He said, "I will ride down to Roseburg in the spring." She said, "I know." He said, "I will ride down to find out which of the 3 is the man of conscience." She said, "I know." He looked up at her. He said, "Magdalena." She said, "Hosea." He said, "Will you keep her until the spring?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Will you keep her in this cabin, in this town, with the doctor at the south end and the church on the main street and the wives of the councilmen who have, by my hearing in the smithy when I came down last summer for an axe blade, called you every small careful word a frontier wife can call a healer she does not want at her well?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Will you let me come down off the high ridge on Saturday mornings and Tuesday evenings to sit at this kitchen table with you and the child until the spring?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Will you let me carry the small wooden horse for her on the days when her own hand is too tired to?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Magdalena." She said, "Yes, Hosea." He said, "I have not asked any woman in 11 years for any small thing. I do not know what I am about to ask. I am asking it anyway. Will you let me find out, with you, between this evening and the spring, whether the small wooden horse on her bedside table is a thing that will stay in this house with her, or whether the small wooden horse will go down to Roseburg in the spring with whichever of the 3 names on the locket turns out to be the man of conscience?" Magdalena Ross looked at him for a long second. She said, "Hosea Kincaid, I will let you find that out with me." She stood up from the kitchen table. She picked up the small folded piece of paper. She walked, slow, the 4 steps to the small bedside table, at the side of the small bed where the small girl named Tessamy Hartley was sleeping the slow, careful sleep of a child whose fever had broken at midnight, and who had not yet woken into the new shape of the world she would be waking into. Magdalena set the small folded piece of paper down on the bedside table beside the small wooden horse. She did not refold the paper. She left it open beside the horse. She said, very low into the room, "Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall ye not know it?" She had not, in the 4 years since her own husband had died of typhoid in the cabin 3 doors east of this one, spoken any line from any book of any Bible aloud in any room. The room did not answer. The small wooden horse on the bedside table beside the open piece of paper did not move. Outside on the porch, the snow began to come down again. The kitchen of the widow Magdalena Ross had not always been the kitchen of a widow. It had been for 4 years before the autumn of 1879, the kitchen of a small Quaker schoolmaster named Caleb Ross, who had moved his bride west from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in the spring of 1876, to take the post of teacher at the small one-room schoolhouse of Silver Pine, Oregon Territory. Caleb Ross had been 31 when he married Magdalena Steiner of Lancaster in the small Quaker meeting house in the village of Lampeter in March of 1875. He had been 37 when he died of typhoid in the small cabin at the western end of Silver Pine in October of 1879. Magdalena had been 34. They had not had any children. They had not had any children, not because they had not wanted them, but because Magdalena Ross' body had been the kind of body that, by the careful judgment of the Lancaster midwife who had attended her own mother's failed second pregnancy, would not carry a child to term. The midwife had told Magdalena this when Magdalena had been 17. The midwife had been a kind woman named Hannah Eschliman. Hannah Eschliman had not been wrong. Magdalena had, by the count of her own 4 years of marriage to Caleb Ross, miscarried twice in the first year, and had been told by a doctor in Portland she had ridden 2 days to see that she would not carry a third. She had not, after that doctor in Portland, looked at any small carved wooden thing the shape of a horse or a sheep or a small wooden lamb in the same way. She had become, in the years that followed, the healer of Silver Pine, because the women of Silver Pine had needed a healer, and because the only other healer in the bleak county, a Methodist circuit rider's wife named Sarah Fenton, had moved to the Dalles in the summer of 1877 to follow her husband east on his new appointment. Magdalena had set up her practice in the second room of the cabin at the western end of town. She had hung her shingle. She had begun her work. She had caught 57 babies in 7 years. She had lost 2 mothers in those 7 years. The first had been a small, thin Welsh woman whose child had presented breech, and whose own heart had given out at the second hour of the labor. The second had been a Cheyenne woman from the small cluster of 3 families that camped each summer at the south end of the valley, whose hemorrhage had been the kind of hemorrhage that the doctor at the south end of town, who had been called and had refused, could not have stopped either. She had not lost a child she could have saved. She had, in the same 7 years, grown from a size 16 to a size 20. The growth had been the slow, steady growth of a woman whose body had been told once that it would not carry a child, and who had decided in her own slow, careful way to live in the body she had. She had not, after the doctor in Portland, tried to be smaller. She had not, after the second miscarriage, tried to be lighter. She had stayed who she had been. She had let her dresses out at the side seams as she needed to. She had not minded. The town of Silver Pine had minded. The town of Silver Pine had not minded for the first 3 years. The town of Silver Pine had begun to mind in the autumn of 1880, when the doctor at the south end of town, who had been hired by the railroad in the spring of that year, had begun to make small, careful remarks in his small, careful parlor about the unprofessional conduct of unlicensed practitioners. He had not, at first, named her. He had not needed to. The wives of the town had taken the small, careful remarks home to their own small, careful kitchens, and the small, careful remarks had become, by the second year, the small, careful judgments the wives offered to any new bride or any visiting cousin who had asked, in passing, who the healer at the western end of town was, and the small, careful judgments had become, by the third year, the kind of judgments that meant a woman like Camilla Beasley of the Beasley Mercantile would say, at the front of the store, in the hearing of 3 other wives, that she would not let her own daughter be caught by the kind of woman who could not, by the look of her at the front of the church on a Christmas Eve, catch herself. The line had gotten back to Magdalena by the spring of 1882. She had not, when it got to her, lost any sleep. She had cooked her supper that evening. She had eaten it slow. She had walked out to the porch with her cup of tea. She had stood for a long time on the porch with a cup of tea in her hand. She had thought, slow, about Hannah Eschliman in Lancaster County, who had told her at 17 that her body would not carry a child. She had thought about her grandmother, Frida Steiner, who had been a Quaker healer in a Pennsylvania farmhouse for 40 years, and who had been twice the size of any man in the village, without losing the respect of any one of them. She had thought about her own husband, Caleb Ross, who had married her at 27, and who had said, on the porch of the Lampeter meeting house on the morning of their wedding day, Magdalena Steiner, do not be smaller for me. I did not marry you small, I married you whole. She had not been smaller. She had not, in the 4 years since Caleb Ross had been buried in the small Quaker cemetery at the western edge of Silver Pine, taken off her wedding band. The wedding band sat on the 3rd finger of her left hand. The wedding band would be on her left hand on the day she opened the front door of the cabin at 20 minutes past 5 on the evening of the 8th of December, 1883, when a tall mountain man she had not met would carry a dying child into her kitchen in his arms. She would, by the morning of the 12th day, take the wedding band off. She would not throw it away. She would lay it, careful, in the small velvet-lined cherry box that held her own grandmother's wedding band, and her own mother's, on the high shelf above the iron stove. She would lay it down because, on the morning of the 12th day, a tall mountain man she had not known on the 7th would ask her to put a different ring on the same finger. But that morning was 9 days away. The chapter was now. She washed the small wooden horse on the morning of the 3rd day with a small clean linen square dipped in warm water, 'cause the small fist had at last opened far enough to let her take the horse out and wash the small palm. She set the horse on the small bedside table where the child could see it from the pillow when the child's eyes opened next. She did not, that morning, look at the 3rd finger of her left hand for any longer than the small natural moment a woman looks at her own left hand when she is washing a small wooden thing in a small linen square. She did look long enough to notice that the wedding band of Caleb Ross was on her finger. She did not that morning take it off. The morning was not yet there. The doctor at the south end of Silver Pine came to the cabin on the morning of the 4th day. He had not been invited. He had heard, by the small, efficient mechanism of any frontier town's gossip, that a mountain man had brought a dying child to the door of the widow Ross at 20 minutes past 5 on the evening of the 8th, and that the child had been on the table of the widow Ross's kitchen for 3 days, and that the child, by the report of the small boy who delivered the morning milk to the back porch of the cabin, was alive. He had not, on hearing this, been pleased. He had ridden out to the cabin at 10:30 in the morning in his black coat and his small black bag and his small gray felt hat on his own black gelding, alone. He had hitched the horse to the rail at the front gate. He had walked the small path to the front porch. He had not, by the careful courtesy of the small-town doctor he had been raised to be, knocked. He had opened the front door. He had stepped into the kitchen. He had seen, at the kitchen table, Magdalena Ross at one end and Hosea Kincaid at the other, and the small girl named Tessamy Hartley sitting up in a small wool blanket on a small wooden chair between them, eating a slow, careful spoonful of warm bread soaked in honeyed milk. He had said, in the small, dry voice he had been bringing into the small, careful parlor of his small, careful judgments for 3 years, "Widow Ross, I would have a word." She had said, "Dr. Pell," he had said, "outside, if you would." She had said, "Inside, the child is at the table. The mountain man is at the table. There is coffee on the back of the stove. You will say what you have to say in front of all 3 of us, or you will say it on the road back to your own end of town." He had not in 3 years been spoken to that way by Magdalena Ross. He had not in 11 years been spoken to that way by any woman in any kitchen of any frontier town. He had been raised by the kind of New England mother who taught her sons that doctors were spoken to by women in the small, careful voice a parishioner uses to a priest, and he had carried that teaching west the way his small black bag had been carried west. He had not, until this morning, been required to put the teaching down. He put it down. He sat at the kitchen table. He did not take off his hat. He did not, by the small, efficient mechanism of his own training, accept the cup of coffee Magdalena set in front of him. He folded his hands on the table. He said, "The child." Magdalena said, "Her name is Tessamy." He said, "The child has been in this kitchen for 94 hours. Has the child been seen by a licensed physician in those 94 hours? Magdalena said, "She has been seen by the only woman in this valley who would receive her at 5:30 on the evening of an 8-inch snowfall. The licensed physician of this valley was, at 5:30 on the evening of the 8th, 200 yards from this cabin, at his own front door, drinking, by the count of his housekeeper, a cup of tea." The doctor did not answer this. He said, "The child requires the attention of a licensed physician. I would prefer to examine her myself. I would prefer also to inform the council of this valley that the child has been in the custody of a woman whose practice in this valley is, by the formal opinion of the county board, irregular." Hosea Kincaid spoke for the first time in the conversation. He had not, until that line, said anything. He had been holding the small wooden spoon for the small girl in the chair beside him. He set the spoon down on the saucer. He said, "Lo, doctor." The doctor said, "Sir." Hosea said, "The child was in a drawer 20 feet below the high pass at sundown on the 8th of December. The child was under the runner of a small wooden trunk. The child had been there for 16 hours. The mother of the child and the father of the child were dead under the wagon 10 feet from her. The child had been calling for her mother for the last 8 hours of those 16, by the look of her own throat, when I lifted her. The child weighed 34 pounds when I picked her up. The child weighs 38 pounds this morning. The child has been seen, in those 94 hours, by the only woman in this valley who would set foot in her own kitchen at 5:30 in the snow to receive her. The child is alive because of that woman. The child will live to be 5 years and 10 months old on the 2nd of February because of that woman." He paused. He said, "Doctor, you will examine her this morning if Magdalena Ross consents to it. I have no opinion on the licensing of healers in this valley. I have the opinion that the child sitting in the chair beside me will not be removed from this cabin by any man in any black coat who did not ride 10 miles up a high pass in a snowstorm to lift a trunk runner off her shoulder. If you would like to remove her by your own argument to the council, you will be required to make that argument in this kitchen with me at this table. You will not be making it on the road back to your own end of town." The doctor looked at Hosea Kincaid for a long second. Hosea Kincaid did not blink. Magdalena Ross said, "Dr. Pell, you may examine her. I will assist you. The child will not be removed from this chair without my hand on her wrist." The doctor examined her. He did the examination in the kind of small, careful, efficient way A man does an examination when he has come to a kitchen prepared to find a body, unsuitably treated, and has not, by the look of the small lungs and the small pulse and the small color of the small cheeks under his thumb, found it. He finished the examination. He stood up. He picked up his black bag. He looked at Magdalena Ross. He said, in a voice that had not been in his small, careful parlor for 11 years, "Widow Ross, the child has been treated by the standards of any licensed physician of any state in the Union, with the kind of care I would not, in this valley, have been able to give her. I will say so to the council at the meeting on the 15th. I will not, however, withdraw the question of the custody. The child is an orphan of unknown attachment. She will require, by the laws of this territory, a placement. The council will decide the placement." He put on his hat. He left. The door closed behind him. Magdalena Ross sat down on the chair beside the small girl. She set her hand on the small back. She did not say anything for a long second. Hosea Kincaid said, "Magdalena." She said, "Hosea." He said, "The council will not place her in this cabin." She said, "No," he said. "The council will place her in the small Methodist orphanage at Portland. There are 47 children in that orphanage. There are 6 sisters. There is not enough food in the winters. I rode past it 3 years ago. I have not forgotten the small faces at the front gate." She said, "I know the orphanage." He said, "We have 10 days. The 15th is 10 days from this morning." She said, "Yes." He said, "We have one decision to make in 10 days." She said, "Yes." He said, "Magdalena." She said, "Hosea." He said, "I will ride down to Roseburg this week. I will ride to the 3 names on the locket. I will read each of them this letter. I will ask each of them whether they would take her. If any of the 3 says yes, the council will have a place to put her that is not the orphanage. If all 3 say no, I will come back to this kitchen on the 14th, and we will, the 2 of us, make the second decision." She said, "What is the second decision?" He said, "The second decision is whether you would marry me on the morning of the 15th, before the meeting, in the small Quaker meeting house at the western end of this town. The second decision is whether a married couple in a clean cabin with the means to feed and clothe a child and the testimony of a doctor that the child has been treated as well as any licensed physician would have treated her, would be a placement the council would accept over the small Methodist orphanage in Portland." She did not say anything for a long second. She said, "Hosea." He said, "Yes." She said, "Ride to Roseburg, ride to the 3 names, ride hard." He said, "I will." She said, "But before you go," he said, "Yes," she said, "set the small wooden horse this morning on the mantel above the iron stove. Take it out of her bedroom, bring it into the kitchen, set it on the mantel beside the small carved oak box that holds Caleb's books. Do that for me before you go." He stood up. He went into the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. He came back out with the small wooden horse in his hand. He walked across the kitchen. He stopped at the iron stove. He looked up at the mantel. He set the small wooden horse on the mantel, careful, beside the small carved oak box that held the books of Caleb Ross. He turned. He looked at Magdalena Ross at the kitchen table. He said, "Magdalena." She said, "Hosea." He said, "I will be back on the 14th." She said, "I will be here." He left. The small girl named Tessamy Hartley, in the small wool blanket on the small wooden chair, looked at the mantel above the iron stove. She looked at the small wooden horse. She said, in her small dry voice, the first sentence she had spoken in any room of any house since the morning of the 8th of December. She said, "Mama Magda, why is my horse on the shelf?" Magdalena Ross did not say anything for a long second. She said, "Sweetness, the horse is on the shelf because the horse is going to live in this kitchen." The small girl thought about this. She said, "All right." She closed her eyes. She leaned her small head against the small wool blanket. She slept, sitting in the chair, against the side of the woman she had, by some small, careful mechanism of her own 4-day fever, decided to call Mama Magda. The mantel above the iron stove held, that morning, 2 things: a small carved oak box of a dead Quaker schoolmaster's books, a small painted wooden horse of a dead Indiana farmer's daughter. The shelf would, by the morning of the 15th, hold a third thing. The third thing would change, slow, what the first two were on the shelf for. Hosea Kincaid rode south for Roseburg on the morning of the 10th. He took the bay mare he kept for winter travel. He took the small, folded piece of paper in his breast pocket. He took the small silver locket of Eliza Hartley, which he had removed from the dead woman's chest under the wagon, on the high pass on the morning of the 8th, and which he had carried in his saddlebag for 2 days without opening. Because the names on the inside of the locket were not, by his own slow, careful judgment, names he had a right to read without the consent of the woman who was now mothering the child, the locket had been written for Magdalena had consented on the morning of the 10th before he saddled. The 3 names inside the locket were Mr. Jonas Hartley, who was the brother of the dead father, of the Coyote Creek farmstead outside Roseburg; Mr. Henry Trumbull, who was the minister of the Roseburg Methodist Church; and Mrs. Cornelia Sayre, who was the sister of the dead mother, of the boarding house on Front Street in Roseburg. Hosea Kincaid rode the small black mare south through the small valleys of southwestern Oregon for 3 days. He reached Roseburg on the afternoon of the 13th. He found the 3 addresses in the same afternoon. He knocked, in order, on the 3 doors. The first door was Mr. Jonas Hartley's. The door was opened by a thin gray woman in a black wool dress who had, by the look of her face, been crying for some time. She said, before Hosea Kincaid had given his name, "If you have come for the Eliza Hartley letter, sir, I will tell you that my husband Jonas Hartley was buried 2 weeks before that letter was written. He died of a chill that came up on him in November. We had been expecting his brother Caleb to take over the farm, because Jonas and I never had children of our own. The letter that came down to me through the freightman this morning told me that Caleb and Eliza are also dead. I have no means in this house to take any small child. I have written my answer to the woman at the western end of Silver Pine, where the freightman said the child is being cared for. I will give you the answer to take back if you are riding north, he had said. Mom, I am riding north. I will take it. She had given him a small folded piece of paper. The paper had said in her hand, Dear Madam, I cannot take the child. I have nothing in this house to give her. I am sorry. With prayer and with grief, Mrs. Jonas Hartley. The second door was the Reverend Henry Trumbull's. The Reverend Henry Trumbull had been a man of 76 who had retired from the Roseburg Methodist Church 2 years before, and who lived in a small cottage at the back of the church grounds with his wife and his unmarried daughter. He had received Hosea Kincaid at his porch. He had taken the small folded piece of paper of Eliza Hartley. He had read it twice. He had set it down on his small porch table. He had said, Mr. Kincaid, I baptized Eliza Hartley when she was 7 months old in this town. I baptized her sister Cornelia when Cornelia was 4. I did not know that Eliza had ridden west with a husband. I had not, by the count of the post, heard her voice in the 18 years since her family moved from Roseburg to Marion, County, Indiana, to take up a farm. I would, if I were 40 years younger, take her child this evening to this porch. I am not 40 years younger. My wife is 74. My daughter is 47 and has been unmarried by her own preference for 30 years. We would not, in this household, be able to raise a child of 5 years to the age of 18. I am sorry, Mr. Kincaid. I will write you a letter you may carry back. He had written. Hosea had taken the letter. The third door was Mrs. Cornelia Sayre's. The Sayre boarding house on Front Street was a small 2-story wooden building with a small green painted sign. The door had been opened by a tall, sharp-eyed woman in a clean white apron over a black wool dress. She had said, yes. Hosea had said, Mrs. Sayre, my name is Hosea Kincaid. I have come down from Silver Pine. I have a letter from your sister Eliza. The woman had stood for 1 long second at the front door of her boarding house. She had then said, Bring it in, Mr. Kincaid. Come into the parlor. I will pour you coffee. Read it to me." She had not cried at the letter. She had cried after he had finished it. She had cried for a count of 7 minutes in the parlor of her own boarding house, with a cup of coffee on the small table at her elbow. She had said when the 7 minutes had ended, "Mr. Kincaid, I am 41 years old. I have been a widow for 9 years. I have no children of my own. I have a boarding house with 7 rooms and a steady trade and a small bank account my husband Ezra left me. I would take my sister's child this evening. I would take her tomorrow. I would take her on any day. Magdalena Ross would put her in a wagon south. I will ride north with you in the morning if you will allow it. I will be at the cabin at the western end of Silver Pine by the 17th of December." Hosea had sat with the empty cup of coffee in his hands. He had looked at the kind, sharp-eyed woman across from him. He had said, "Lo, Mrs. Sayer, I will ride north tomorrow. I would prefer that you come in your own time, in your own wagon, with whatever wages of fare you require. I would prefer that you arrive at Silver Pine on the 17th, as you say. I would prefer that the council meeting at the western end of Silver Pine on the 15th of December be conducted, before your arrival, by Magdalena Ross and myself. I will tell you why." He had told her why. He had told her about the small wooden horse on the mantel above the iron stove. He had told her about the small girl named Tessamy Hartley, sitting in the small wool blanket on the small wooden chair, calling Magdalena Ross by the name Mama Magda. He had told her about the doctor at the south end of Silver Pine, and the council meeting on the 15th, and the small Methodist orphanage in Portland, and the decision the council would make. He had asked her a question. He had asked her, "Mrs. Sayer, if you arrive at the cabin at Silver Pine on the 17th, and the small girl, Tessamy Hartley, is sitting at the kitchen table calling the woman across from her Mama Magda, and the man at the other end of the table, Papa Hosea, would you be willing to consider letting the small girl stay where she is? Would you be willing to come north as her aunt, not as her mother? Would you be willing to spend the small, steady, frequent time at Silver Pine that an aunt spends with a child she loves? And would you be willing to leave the daily raising of the child in the hands of the woman the child has already chosen?" Cornelia Sayer had sat for a long second in the parlor of her own boarding house with her own empty cup of coffee in her hands. She had said, "Mr. Kincaid." He had said, "Mom." She had said, "I will tell you a thing. I was the older sister. When Eliza was 7 and I was 11, I was the one who carried her down the slope of the orchard at the back of our father's house in Roseburg every afternoon, because Eliza's small left leg had been turned at the hip at her birth, and she could not walk far without help. I carried her every afternoon for 2 years. I do not today regret a single one of the carries. But I knew by the 2nd year that I was the kind of woman who would prefer to be the aunt of a small girl, rather than the mother of a small girl. I knew it at 13. I have not changed." She had said, "Mr. Kincaid, I will come north on the 17th. I will sit at your kitchen table. I will look at the small girl. If this call is calling the woman across the table, Mama Magda, I will not interfere. I will be her aunt. I will come up for Easter and for the small girl's birthday in April, and for the harvest in September. I will not move her south. I will not put her in any orphanage in Portland or anywhere else. I will write a letter to the council at Silver Pine on the morning of the 14th, so that the letter is in the hands of the doctor at the south end of town before the meeting on the 15th. The letter will say, in my own hand, that I, the surviving sister of the dead mother, do hereby decline the custody of the child in favor of the household of Magdalena Ross of Silver Pine, who has, by the report of the man at my parlor table this evening, treated the child as well as any blood relation could." Hosea Kincaid had set the empty cup on the small table at the side of his chair. He had said, "Cornelia Sayer." She had said, "Yes, Mr. Kincaid." He had said, "I will ride north tomorrow at sunrise. I will carry your letter. I will tell Magdalena Ross what you have said. I will tell the small girl in the kitchen that her aunt from Roseburg is coming up to meet her on the 17th. She had said, "Tell her also that her aunt has, in the boarding house on Front Street, a small chestnut mare named Ginger who, by the small, careful judgment of the stableman, is well suited to teaching a small 5-year-old child the seat of a saddle. The mare will come north on the 17th in the wagon behind me. The mare will be the small girl's if she would like it." He had said, "Mum, she will like it." He had ridden north at sunrise on the morning of the 14th. He had carried in his breast pocket 2 folded letters, one from Mrs. Jonas Hartley, one from the Reverend Henry Trumbull. He had carried in his inside coat pocket the 3rd letter, the one from Cornelia Sayer, which he would deliver to the doctor at the south end of Silver Pine on his way through town on the morning of the 15th, after he had ridden up to the cabin at the western end and had given the news to Magdalena. He had reached the cabin at the western end of Silver Pine at sundown on the 14th. He had not, in his 11 years on the high ridge above this town, ridden a horse harder than he rode the small black mare on the 3rd day of that ride. He had reached the cabin. He had stepped down off the mare. He had walked up the porch step. He had opened the door. Magdalena Ross was at the kitchen table. The small girl, Tessamy Hartley, was at the table across from her. The 2 of them had been reading from a small primer the schoolmistress had lent them. The small girl had been reading, slow and careful, the first words of a small lesson. He had said at the door, "Magdalena." She had stood up. She had set down the small primer. She had said, "Hosea." He had said, "Cornelia." She had said, "Cornelia." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "The meeting is in the morning." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "We have one more thing to settle tonight." She had said, "Yes." He had taken off his hat. The thing they settled that night, at the kitchen table with the small girl, Tessamy Hartley, already asleep in the small bed at the back of the cabin, with the small wooden horse in her small hand, because Magdalena had brought the horse down from the mantel for the night, because the small girl had asked, was the second decision. Hosea Kincaid took off his hat at the door. He hung the hat on the small peg beside the door. He took off his fur-lined coat. He hung the coat on the second peg. He turned. He walked the 4 steps to the kitchen table. He sat down in the chair across from Magdalena Ross. He set his hands flat on the kitchen table. He said, "Magdalena." She said, "Hosea." He said, "I have not, in any of the 3 days I have been riding, thought about the second decision." She said, "No." He said, "I have thought about it for 11 years." She said, "I know." He said, "I have not known it was about you for the 11 years. She said, "No." He said, "I have known since the 2nd day of the ride south to Roseburg that it has always been about you." She said, "Hosea." He said, "Yes." She said, "Will you ask me, so I do not have to ask you?" So he said, "Magdalena Ross, will you marry me in the morning at the small Quaker meeting house at the western end of this town? Will you let me stand beside you at the meeting at the south end of this town at noon? Will you let me sign my name on the small careful piece of paper the council will require us to sign for the small girl asleep in the bed at the back of this cabin? Will you let the small girl call me what she has? By the report you sent me with the milk boy this morning, already started to practice calling me." She said, "Yes, Hosea." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." He said, "Magdalena." She said, "Hosea." He said, "Your hand." She held out her left hand. He took it. He looked slow at the 3rd finger of the left hand. He looked at the wedding band of Caleb Ross. He said, "Magdalena, may I?" She said, "Yes." He slid the wedding band, slow, off the 3rd finger of her left hand. He set the wedding band, careful, on the kitchen table between them. He said, "Tomorrow morning, before the meeting house, you will lay this in the cherry box on the high shelf above the iron stove, with your grandmother's band and your mother's. You will put on, in its place, the band I will bring with me to the meeting house in the morning. I have it in my breast pocket. It belonged to my own mother, Tabitha Kincaid of Knox County, Tennessee. It is the only thing of any person of my own I have carried with me for 34 years. I would have it on your hand by noon tomorrow. She said, Hosea Kincaid, I will lay Caleb's band in the cherry box. I will wear your mother's. He stood up. He came around the kitchen table. He knelt at the side of her chair. He set his right hand on top of her left hand on the kitchen table. He said, Magdalena. She said, Hosea. He said, I will not, on any morning of any year ahead of us, ask you to be smaller than you are. I will not ask you to be lighter than you are. I will not ask you to be more careful than you are. I will not ask you to be more polite to any small careful doctor or any small careful wife of any small careful councilman at the south end of any town we ever live near. She said, Hosea. He said, I will only ask you to be the woman who opened her front door at 20 minutes past 5 on the evening of the 8th of December to a tall mountain man she had never met with a dying child in his arms, and who set her hands on the small ribs of that child without asking what the council of the south end of town would say about it in the morning. She said, Hosea. He said, I will in return be the man who carries the bag for you on any walk in any winter you would have me carry it. I will be the man who sits at the kitchen table for any meal you would have me sit at. I will be the man who lights the lamp at the front of this cabin every Tuesday and Friday evening, so that any sick child in this valley who is brought to your door at sundown by any father, by any uncle, by any neighbor, by any stranger, will see the light from a quarter-mile out, and will not wonder, in the dark, whether the door of this cabin will open. She did not say anything for a long second. She said, Hosea Kincaid. He said, yes. She said, I will marry you in the morning. He kissed her hand. He did not kiss her on the forehead. He did not, by some small, careful Quaker formality he had not, in 11 years, given up, kiss her on the lips at the kitchen table either. He kissed the back of her left hand at the third finger, where the wedding band had been 10 minutes before. He stood up. I will sleep in the lean-to. I will be at the meeting house at 9:30. The Reverend Pike from the Methodist Church has agreed to read the small Quaker service for us in the small Quaker meeting house, because there is no Quaker minister within 40 miles. The school mistress will be there. The blacksmith and his wife will be there. The small girl will be there in her best small wool dress. She said, Hosea. He said, yes. She said, Mr. Brennan at the smithy will come. He said, he will come. She said, Cornelia Sayre will not arrive until the 17th. He said, no. She said, but she will write. He said, she will write. The letter is in my inside coat pocket. I will deliver it to Dr. Pell on the road through town in the morning, before the meeting house. She said, then we are settled. He said, we are settled. She said, Hosea. He said, yes. She said, on the mantel above the iron stove, the small wooden horse comes back up tomorrow. He said, yes. She said, it will sit beside the small carved oak box of Caleb's books. He said, yes. She said, and the small velvet-lined cherry box of the 3 wedding bands. He said, yes. She said, 3 things on the shelf. He said, 3 things on the shelf. He went out. He shut the door behind him soft. He walked across the snow to the lean-to. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She did not get up. She did not bank the fire for an hour. She did not, in the long sitting, take any line from any book of any Bible into her mouth aloud. She did not need to. But she did take the small wooden horse off the small bedside table. Soft, with the small girl's hand finally relaxed in sleep, and she carried it across the kitchen and she set it back, careful, on the mantel above the iron stove, where it would be in the morning when the small girl woke up to the morning of the 15th of December, 1883, and where it would, by all the slow, steady years of the cabin to come, be every morning of every winter for the rest of the small girl's life. She went to bed. She slept. The morning came at 20 minutes past 7. The Quaker meeting house at the western end of Silver Pine had been built in 1879 by Caleb Ross with his own hands, and the hands of the 4 other Quaker families who had come west on the same wagon train. The meeting house was a small, square wooden building with 4 small windows. The windows had no glass. The windows had small wooden shutters that were closed against the snow. Caleb Ross had been the only Quaker man left in Silver Pine by the autumn of 1880, because the other 4 families had moved north to Salem in the spring of that year. He had kept the meeting house clean and the small wooden benches polished and the small lamp at the front trimmed every Sunday morning for the 11 months between the move and his death. After his death, Magdalena had kept the meeting house clean for 2 years every Saturday morning alone. The town had not used it. The town had not asked her to clean it. She had cleaned it because Caleb had cleaned it, and because she was, after Caleb, the last Quaker in Silver Pine. It was the only church in the valley willing to marry a widow and a mountain man on 3 days' notice in December. The Reverend Tobias Pike of the small Methodist church on Main Street, who was 67 years old and Welsh-born, and the kind of man who had married 14 couples in 31 years in this valley and had not, by his own count, ever turned down a kind one, had agreed to read the small Quaker service. He had asked for no money. He had asked, on the morning Hosea had ridden into town to set the wedding, only one question. The question had been, "Mr. Kincaid, will the small girl be at the meeting house?" Hosea had said, "Yes, sir." The Reverend had said, "Then I will read the service." There is no kinder reason to read a service than for a small girl who needs to see a mother and a father stand up together. "I will see you on the 15th at 9:30. The 15th was now. Magdalena Ross had put on her best dark blue prairie dress at 8:20. She had braided the small girl Tessamy Hartley's hair into 2 careful braids at 9:20. She had pinned a small sprig of dried winter sage to the front of the small girl's small wool coat. She had walked, with the small girl, the 400 yards from the cabin at the western end of town to the small Quaker meeting house. The schoolmistress had walked beside her. The schoolmistress's name was Iris Whitfield. Iris Whitfield had been Magdalena's only steady friend in Silver Pine since 1881. Hosea Kincaid had been waiting at the meeting house with the Reverend Pike, the blacksmith, Mr. Brennan, and Mr. Brennan's wife, Hetty. He had been wearing a clean white linen shirt with a black cravat and a clean black wool coat he had borrowed from Mr. Brennan on the morning of the 14th. The Reverend Pike read the service. He read it slow. He read it in the small, steady voice he used on Sundays at the Methodist church. He read, in place of the Pauline marriage passage, the verse from the Gospel of Mark, which the small Quaker meeting house, by Caleb Ross' careful hand, had carved into the small wooden lintel above the meeting house door in 1879. The verse was, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, and forbid them not. For of such is the kingdom of God." He read the verse. He looked up at the small girl in the second bench. He smiled, slow. He read the small Quaker vows. He said, "Hosea Kincaid, in the presence of God and these our friends, I take Magdalena Ross to be my wife, promising, with divine assistance, to be unto her a loving and faithful husband so long as we both shall live." Hosea said, "I do so promise." The Reverend said, Magdalena Ross, in the presence of God and these our friends, I take Hosea Kincaid to be my husband, promising, with divine assistance, to be unto him a loving and faithful wife, so long as we both shall live. Magdalena said, "I do so promise." He gave them the small Quaker blessing. He closed the small book. Hosea Kincaid took the small wedding band of his own mother, Tabitha Kincaid, out of the inside breast pocket of his black wool coat. He took Magdalena Ross' left hand. He slid the band onto the 3rd finger of her left hand. She looked at the band on her own hand for 1 long second. She did not, by any small mechanism of the morning, cry. She kissed Hosea Kincaid on the cheek. She turned. She walked the 2 steps to the second bench. She knelt down in front of the small girl Tessamy Hartley. She put her arms around the small wool coat. She said into the small ear, "Sweetness, you may call him Papa Hosea now if you would like." The small girl said, "I have been calling him Papa Hosea since yesterday." Magdalena said, I know, sweetness. The small girl said, Mama Magda. Magdalena said yes. The small girl said, Can we go to the meeting at the south end now? Magdalena said, We can, sweetness. They went. The council meeting at the south end of Silver Pine was held at noon in the small wooden hall behind the Methodist Church on Main Street. The meeting was attended by Dr. Alfred Pell, by Mr. Edwin Beasley of the Beasley Mercantile, by Mr. Joel Carstairs of the Freight Depot, by Mr. Hiram Latham of the Assay Office, and by the small clerk of the council named Mr. Pettigrew of Mr. Beasley's accounts office. The clerk had a small bound book. The 5 council men were seated at the long table. The doctor was at the head of the table. He had on his small black coat and his small gray felt hat. Hosea Kincaid and Magdalena Kincaid, who had been Magdalena Ross at 20 minutes past 9 that morning, walked into the small wooden hall at 3 minutes past noon, with the small girl Tessamy Hartley between them in her best small wool coat. The doctor looked up. He saw the small wedding band on Magdalena's left hand. He looked at Hosea Kincaid in the clean white linen shirt and the borrowed black wool coat. He looked at the small clerk. He said, Mr. Pettigrew, read the letter. The small clerk picked up the letter from Cornelia Sayer, which Hosea had handed to the doctor at the south end of town at 15 minutes past 9 that morning, before riding up the road to the small Quaker meeting house. The small clerk read the letter aloud. The letter said, in the slow, steady hand of Cornelia Sayer of the boarding house on Front Street in Roseburg, that the surviving sister of the dead mother of the orphaned child, Tessamy Hartley, did hereby decline the custody of the child in favor of the household of Magdalena Ross of Silver Pine. The letter said that the surviving sister had spoken at length with Mr. Hosea Kincaid of the High Ridge north of Silver Pine, who had presented the case for the placement to her in her own parlor, and that she had been satisfied with the case. The letter said that the surviving sister would arrive in Silver Pine on or about the 17th of December to meet her niece and to give her own small wedding present to the household. The letter said that the surviving sister would, in the years to come, visit at Easter, at the small girl's birthday in April, and at the autumn harvest. The small clerk set the letter down. The doctor looked at the 4 other councilmen. The 4 other councilmen looked at the doctor. Mr. Edwin Beasley of the Beasley Mercantile said, in the small dry voice of a frontier merchant, Dr. Pell, the blood aunt has declined the custody in favor of a household that, as of 3 hours ago, is the household of a married couple in this valley. There is no orphanage placement before this council this afternoon. There is the question of whether the council confirms the placement the blood aunt has named. Dr. Pell said, There is also the question of whether the council should require the surviving aunt to take the child. Mr. Beasley said, Doctor, the blood aunt's letter is clear. The aunt would prefer the placement she has named. We are not in the habit, in this council, of overruling blood relations in favor of orphanages 200 miles away. Mr. Joel Carstairs of the Freight Depot said, I will second that. I will move that the council confirm the placement of the minor child Tessamy Hartley with the household of Mr. and Mrs. Hosea Kincaid of the western end of Silver Pine, Oregon Territory, as the placement is named in the letter of the blood aunt Mrs. Cornelia Sayer of Roseburg. Mr. Hiram Latham of the Assay Office said, Second, the small clerk wrote. Dr. Pell said, All in favor. Mr. Beasley said, Aye. Mr. Carstairs said, Aye. Mr. Latham said, Aye. Dr. Pell did not say anything. Mr. Beasley said, Doctor. 3 ayes carry the motion. We are settled. Dr. Pell looked at his hands on the table. He looked up. He looked at Magdalena Kincaid at the back of the room. He looked at Hosea Kincaid beside her. He looked at the small girl between them. He said, in the kind of voice he had not, by his own count, used in 11 years in any room of this valley, Mrs. Kincaid, the council confirms the placement. The placement is in your household. Magdalena said, Dr. Pell, thank you. Dr. Pell looked down again. He cleared his throat. He said, "Mrs. Kincaid, I will not, on any morning of any year ahead, make any further small careful remarks at any small careful parlor of this valley about the practice you keep at the western end of town. I will not undo the 3 years of remarks I have made. But I will not, by the count of the small girl standing between you and her father, add a single one more." Magdalena said, "Dr. Pell, that is more than I had asked, thank you." The council meeting adjourned. The small clerk wrote down the date. Hosea Kincaid and Magdalena Kincaid and the small girl Tessamy Kincaid, who had been Tessamy Hartley at 3 minutes past noon, walked out the front door of the small wooden hall behind the Methodist Church on Main Street at 20 minutes past noon. The snow had stopped. The sun was out. They walked, slow, the 400 yards back to the cabin at the western end of town. Cornelia Sayer arrived on the afternoon of the 17th in a wagon with a small chestnut mare tied to the back. The mare's name was Ginger. The mare was, by the count of the stableman in Roseburg, well suited to teaching a small 5-year-old child the seat of a saddle. The small girl Tessamy Kincaid, who had been Tessamy Hartley 9 days before, came out of the cabin in her small wool coat and her small red knit hat and her best small braids when the wagon pulled up to the gate. She did not run. She walked. She walked, slow and careful, the way she had been walking for 9 days since the fever had broken. The way a small girl walks who has decided that running is a thing for next year. She walked up to the wagon. She looked at the chestnut mare. She looked at the woman on the wagon bench. She said, "Are you my Aunt Cornelia?" Cornelia Sayer, 41 years old, of the boarding house on Front Street in Roseburg, who had wept for 7 minutes in her own parlor at the news of her sister's death, and who had not, on the long 3 ride north, wept again, did not say anything for a long second. She said, "Sweetness, I am your Aunt Cornelia." The small girl said, "Mama Magda said you would come on the 17th. Cornelia said, "I came on the 17th. The small girl said, "Mama Magda said you have a mare named Ginger for me." Cornelia said, "I have." The small girl said, "Aunt Cornelia, can I touch her?" Cornelia said, "Sweetness, she is yours. You may touch her every day for the rest of her life." The small girl walked, slow and careful, to the side of the small chestnut mare. She put her small mittened hand soft on the warm side of the mare's neck. The mare turned her head. The mare smelled the small hand. The mare did not flinch. The small girl said, into the warm side of the mare's neck, very small, the word she had not, in the 9 days since the fever, said to any horse or any small wooden carving or any small picture book in any room of the cab. She said, "Papa." She said it to the mare, not to the man on the porch. She said it because the mare had been her father's brother's wife's idea, and because the small, careful chain of kindness that had brought the mare north was the kind of chain her own father, who had carved a small wooden horse for her on her 3rd birthday, would have liked, and because the small girl was old enough at 5 years and 8 months to know that a horse named Ginger was a thing her own dead father would have approved of. She did not say the word loud, only the mare heard it. The mare blew soft into the small wool of her shoulder. The small girl walked back, slow and careful, to the front of the wagon. She held up her small mittened hand to Cornelia Sayer. Cornelia took the small mittened hand. She climbed down off the wagon. She went up to the porch. Magdalena Kincaid was on the porch in her gray wool shawl. Hosea Kincaid was beside her in his fur-lined coat. Cornelia said, "Mr. Kincaid." He said, "Mrs. Sayer." Cornelia said, "Mrs. Kincaid." Magdalena said, "Cornelia, you will call me Magda. The small girl has decided." "I will not argue with her." Cornelia said, "Magda." She held out her hand. Magdalena took it. The 2 women stood for a long second on the porch of the cabin at the western end of Silver Pine with their hands joined. And the small girl in the small wool coat and the small red knit hat sitting on the wagon bench behind them, looking up at the small wooden lintel of the porch where Hosea Kincaid had carved, on the morning of the 16th, in his slow, careful hand, the small words, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." That night the four of them, Magdalena and Hosea and Cornelia and Tessamy, ate the slow, careful supper Magdalena had been cooking since noon. The supper was a roast of elk Hosea had brought down off the high ridge on the morning of the 14th. The supper was good. The supper was eaten by all four. The small girl ate seconds. The small girl had not, by the count of her aunt, looked anything like a small girl on the inside of a small wool blanket on a small wooden chair on the 8th of December, 9 days before. Cornelia stayed 3 days. She left on the morning of the 20th. She left the chestnut mare named Ginger in the small lean-to at the side of the cabin. She rode back to Roseburg in her wagon. She wrote, 3 weeks later, a long, careful letter to Magdalena that said, in the last line, Magda, the small girl Tessamy chose well, I have not. In 9 years of widowhood and 41 years of life, slept as well as I slept the 3 nights I slept under your roof. I will be back in April for her birthday. She came back in April. She came back in September. She came back every Easter and every April and every September for 31 years, until she died of a stroke at the kitchen table of her boarding house at the age of 72, in the spring of 1914. That is the end of the story. I have one more thing to tell you. The small wooden horse stayed on the mantel above the iron stove of the cabin at the western end of Silver Pine, Oregon, for the rest of Magdalena Kincaid's life. The small carved oak box of Caleb Ross books sat beside it. The small, velvet-lined cherry box of the 3 wedding bands of 3 generations of Steiner women, including the wedding band of Caleb Ross, laid down on the morning of the 15th of December, 1883, sat on the other side. 3 things on the shelf. Hosea Kincaid, who had been Tessamy Hartley, grew up in that cabin. She learned from Magdalena the names of every herb on the second shelf of the kitchen cupboard. She learned from Hosea the names of every tree on the high south face of the ridge above the cabin. She learned from Cornelia every spring and every autumn the small, careful arithmetic of running a boarding house. She rode the chestnut mare named Ginger for the next 19 years, until the mare died at the age of 23 in the spring of 1902. She married at the age of 24 a young blacksmith named Daniel Brennan, the son of Mr. Brennan the blacksmith, who had stood as Hosea's best man on the morning of the 15th of December, 1883. She took, after her wedding, the small wooden horse off the mantel above the iron stove of the cabin at the western end of Silver Pine, and she carried it in a small velvet pouch she had sewn for it from a scrap of her wedding dress to her own new cabin at the eastern end of town. She set the small wooden horse on her own mantel. The small wooden horse has been on a mantel in a kitchen in the valley of Silver Pine, Oregon, every winter since the 8th of December, 1883. The hand that carved it in Marion County, Indiana, on the 2nd of April, 1881, has been gone for 41 Decembers as I write this. The small painted horse is still on the mantel. That is the end of the story.